Hello, welcome to our Bible study. We are looking at Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5. And our subject is Jesus, a high priest, our high priest. The Sunday school lesson's title is actually Learning About Our High Priest. Many times the book of Hebrews is difficult to understand, not because of the depth of the doctrine, though there are some very deep doctrines here, but it is because the culture is so unusual to us. We do not have a priesthood like the Jewish people did. So that makes it a little bit harder for us to understand what it means when we talk about Jesus being our high priest. But I hope that as we continue this lesson, that you will begin to understand how important that is for us as we compare the Jewish high priest to Jesus Christ, our current high priest. I'm going to start by reading the first 4 verses of Hebrews chapter 5. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin, who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way, for he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And by reason thereof he ought as for all the people, let me start verse 3 again. And by reason thereof he ought, as for the people, so also for himself to offer for sins. And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron. God established the priesthood and the office of the high priest during the days of Moses. If we go to the book of Exodus chapter 28 and throughout the rest of the writings of Moses, we will begin to see that. Now, the writer of Hebrews very simply summarizes the entire work of the high priest. Now, the most important function, I guess you could say, of the high priest was this, is that he offered sacrifice and gifts on behalf of the people. It has been said that the priest represented the people to God, while the prophets represented God to the people. And there's a great truth to that. But part of what the high priest did, or an under priest under his supervision, was to offer gifts and sacrifices. We are most familiar with the sin offerings, the whole burnt offerings, maybe the offerings that are offered on the Day of Atonement, where these things are done for the sins of the nation. These sacrifices are made for the sins of the individual. But there are many other sacrifices besides sin offerings. There were thanksgiving offerings. There were love offerings. There were offerings for a number of different things that you just gave to God because of your great love for Him. And the same is true today. We talk about our gifts and our offerings, our tithes and our offerings. And we do have obligations that we need to meet toward God, but then that is just the beginning. We also have a responsibility to just express our love to God in material and physical ways. Now, this was not all that the priests were supposed to do, especially the high priest. I think it's very easy when we do the same thing over and over. And remember, yes, this is a repetitive action. There are sin offerings in the morning. There are sin offerings in the evening. There are offerings that just come in over and over. And I think that there's always the danger of the possibility of something becoming very, very mechanical. Even in our world today, I think that there's the danger that our Christianity becomes very mechanical. We do this, we do this, we do this, we don't do this, we don't do that, we don't do the other thing. And it just becomes, we do our Christianity without a whole lot of thought behind it. And I think it was easy for the priest to, okay, here's a lamb, kill the lamb, butcher the lamb, scrape the fat off this part, take the entrails from here, throw this away, put this on the offering, preserve this for a meat offering, give this portion back to the people. And the writer of Hebrews tells us in verse 2 that we are to do so with compassion. The priest, especially the high priest that we're talking about here, has an obligation to not just mechanically do these things, but he is to have compassion upon the child of God. He talks about those who are ignorant and going astray here. There are lots of ways that we can talk about sin. We can talk about there are overt sins. Those are the sins that we know are we do that we don't do. Okay, let me try that again. There are certain things that we should do and we don't do those, and those are kind of overt is actually we know it's wrong, but we do it anyway. There are things that we don't know or we're supposed to do and we don't do those, and those are our covert sins. We have sins that are public. We have sins that are private. But there are sins that we do ignorantly, and we have sins that we do presumptuously. And especially for those who sin ignorantly, those are the people that need compassion and they need understanding. And the reason why the priest needs to have understanding and have compassion is that a human high priest is just as likely to have these sins as anyone else. I know too often we put clergy up on a pedestal, and when a clergy person falls, the fall is much further, the fall is much harder. Many times we are less likely to forgive a clergy who sins that if someone else in the church commits the same sin. And the priest is not to feel superior over those who do sin, because again, he is so subject to the same things. And because of that, verse 3 tells us that even as he makes sin offerings for the people, he needs to make sin offerings from himself. And that was part of the law. When a new priest, high priest, came upon the scene, there were certain rituals, certain sacrifices that had to be made dedicating a priest. Now we see these in the book of Exodus explained to us particularly for Aaron and his sons. But again, this was continuing all the time. But not only at the beginning of his ministry, but every year the high priest was responsible for making the atonement, the Day of Atonement sacrifices. And the first sacrifice that he made for the Day of Atonement was for himself. That was to remind him, but also to remind the people that he is a man of like passion, like strength, and like weaknesses. And we need to keep that ever mindful in front of us, that we are only human, and that maybe my weakness isn't somebody else's weakness, and somebody else's weakness isn't mine, and I would never do that. Well, maybe not, but maybe you'll do something that other person would never do. And verse 4 tells us, no man takes this honor upon himself. God was very, very specific. Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob, whose name was changed to that of Israel. Israel had 12 sons. One of those sons was by the name of Levi. Levi had 3 sons, and each of these 3 sons were given a responsibility in the tabernacle. And you can read, some of them were responsible for taking care of the gates and the curtains and the fittings. Other people were responsible for the articles of furniture that were in the ark. Some were responsible for the leading of the singing and the leading of the teachings. But out of all the Levites, God chose Aaron and his sons to act as the priest. They were the ones who were going to be responsible. And it was passed down through the family as long as the person did not disqualify themselves. We know that two of Aaron's sons offered strange fire to the Lord, and because of that they were punished by death, and therefore they could not take up their responsibility. God chose through this method, always Aaron's descendants will be my priest. They will do the work of the priest. And we see in the scripture that there are a number of times when individuals take upon themselves the responsibilities of the priesthood, and God punishes them because of that. We know that King Saul got impatient waiting on Samuel, and he came and he offered sacrifice before the Lord. Samuel arrives, and because of his sin, Saul, the kingdom was taken from him. Many years later, King Uzziah again went into the temple and he offered sacrifices to the Lord on the altar of God. And he was struck down by leprosy. And there are others that are mentioned in the Bible as well. But no man can take this honor upon themselves because it is ordained of God to each and every one of them. Now, verses 5 and 6. So also Christ glorified not himself to be made a high priest, but he said unto him, Thou art my son, today I have begot thee. And in another place, Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Christ did not make himself a high priest. Instead, God declared Jesus to be his son, and he declared him to be a priest forever. Verse 6 mentions the order of Melchizedek. Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, and I think this is one of the problems that some of the Jewish people might have had with the priesthood of Christ. They understood from the Old Testament to be the high priest, to be a priest, you had to be a Levite, you had to be of the tribe or of the family of Aaron. Jesus was of the family of David and of the house of Judah, and he could not, according to God's order, be a Levitical or an Aaron priesthood. But God declares him a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, later we're going to see in chapter 7 much more about Melchizedek. But Melchizedek was the king of Salem. Salem is the ancient city of Jerusalem. It is a Hebrew word that means peace, so we can call him the King of Peace, which is a title that we also use for Christ today. But Christ, God declared him to be his son and declared him to be a priest forever. Now, verses 7 and 8. Who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in him that feared. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. I truly believe that the day in particular, that the writer of Hebrews is talking about is there in Matthew and also in the Gospel of Luke in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know there that Jesus made great prayers. He began to pour out and make supplications before the Lord. A theologian by the name of Trapp says this: most ardent request, urgent with deep sighs, hands lifted up, and manifold means in a most submissive manner, is how he describes these various prayers that Christ was offering on that occasion. We know that he cried out to God. The Bible tells us that one of the prayer requests, if there was any way possible that the Father would remove this cup from him, that he would not have to drink of the cup of this death, the crucifixion, but more importantly, the being made sin, the being forsaken by God, the paying of the penalty of our debt for us. he prayed these things to God. But he is glorified in that even though he was a son, he was obedience. Someone has said we learn obedience not by discipline, but we learn obedience by being obedient. And Jesus Christ was that. He cried out, not my will, but your will being done. And the Father heard him. And he suffered many things because of that. Verse 9 tells us, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him, called of God, and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. The word perfect here means complete. It means mature here. Now, Christ is complete. He is mature, but in his sufferings, he exhibited, he revealed to us that he has been perfected, and because of that, he is able to become the author of our salvation. Now, I can take a book, and I can rewrite that book. I can change the name of the characters, I can change some of the events, and I can change some of the circumstances. But most likely, sooner or later, someone's going to catch on, he stole that book. He plagiarized this book to write his book with. Well, I'm going to tell you the truth. There are a lot of people who want to reject Jesus as the author of our salvation. We want to write our own story of salvation. We want to be the ones in control of our destiny. We want to be the one who make the decisions on how we are going to go to heaven. We're the ones who make the decision of how we worship God. But the reality is that Christ is the one. Christ is the author of our salvation. He is the originator. And he is the one who says, this is the way you're saved. You are saved by believing in me. Solely. Period. End of statement. He died, he rose again, and he lives for us today. And again, he is called a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Jesus is a high priest called by God, not by personal ambition, and again, Melchizedek, who we will see much, much more about in chapter 7. Verse 12 says, For when for the time ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as to have need of milk and not of strong meat. We see Jesus. We see him in his completeness. We see him in his maturity. We see him in his perfection. And the writer of Hebrews, in verse 12, starts revealing and exposing to the Jewish people their immaturity. And the reality is, he's not just showing the Jewish people their immaturity. It's written for us today. It's for our edification. It's reminding us is that we are also immature, or we need to be growing in maturity at all the time. These people, I do not know how long they have been Christians. But whoever the writer is believes that they should be further along. A number of years ago, there was a celebrity in Hollywood that I will not name who made a profession of faith. And just a few weeks after that, he was on a television program. And he was using a lot of profanity in this reality type show. And a lot of, his Christianity is really real. The truth is that he was a young Christian. He was immature. He did not know better. But over the years, as he has matured in his faith and has grown and has come to understand, his life has changed. His character has changed. He has a deeper understanding, and he has moved on toward completion and maturity. One of my favorite stories that I like to tell is of a rescue mission in California that used to have it on the early news programs in the morning. Would have a report of, we had this many people come in, we had this many meals served, we had this happen, and this things. And they would usually have a testimony of someone that was there and was being helped by the shelter. And then one night they had this this man who came, and he was being interviewed, and he was telling everyone that he had gotten saved, that he was, born again. And they asked, how do you know that you've been born again? And he opens his coat up, and he reaches into the coat pocket, and he pulls out a bottle of whiskey. And he said, because I've only drank half this bottle of whiskey. If I hadn't got saved, I would probably be on my second or third bottle of whiskey. I know that's a little funny in some ways, but the reality is true. We're born. We're children. We need gentle things. We need time. We do not expect a newborn baby to be able to do calculus. We don't expect them to be able to do physics. We don't expect them to speak English or whatever language it is that they come from. We know that it takes time for them to grow, and it takes time. But here the writer of Hebrews is telling them, you have been Christians long enough that you should know these things. And here I am having to go back and remind you of these basic principles. Now, there's nothing wrong of being reminded of the basic principles. It's important that we go back and we look at the basics. We call them the fundamentals in sports. A lot of times an athlete, they don't practice the alley-oop dunks and things like that. That comes out of practicing the basic dribble. It comes out of the basic layup or the jump shot. Whatever, it comes from the basics. We need to have a solid foundation in the basics, but we need to grow beyond the basics in our faith. And he says, right now, you should be after the strong meat. You should be eating steak and potatoes with Texas toast and a salad, but you still need meat at this time. Verse 13 says, for everyone that uses milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. I'm going to just say a few words, and we're going to end right there with that. The writer of Hebrews is saying the person who is just on this simple stuff, who has to be taught the very basics of Christianity time and time again. They can't go beyond the gospel stories. And when I say gospels, I mean the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John stories, the parables and the events that happen. And those are important. We need those. But we need to get to Romans. We need to get to Hebrews. We need to get to Revelation. We need to get to the deeper things. And we need to be able to take those things and apply them to our day-to-day lives. There are a lot of people that have a lot of facts. They have a lot of information. They have knowledge. But we need to move beyond knowledge to wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to take those things that we have heard, which we have read, which we have studied, and move beyond the first century. Move beyond Zacchaeus and John and the rich young ruler, and apply them to the 21st century and to ourselves today. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Holy Father, as we come before you tonight, we thank you for our great high priest, Jesus Christ. Look forward to getting to chapter 7, where we consider even more the ministry of Christ as our high priest as he makes intercession for us and how important that is. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.